Salman Rushdie is the author of 11 novels, Grimus, Midnight's Children, for which he won the Booker Prize and the Best of the Booker, Shame, The Satanic Verses, Haroun and the Sea of Stories, The Moor's Last Sigh, The Ground Beneath Her Feet, Fury, Shalimar the Clown, The Enchantress of Florence, and Luca and the Fire of Life, and one collection of short stories, East and West. He's also published 3 works of nonfiction, The Jaguar's Smile, Imaginary Homelands, and Step Across This Line. He's a former president of American Pen and chair of the Pen World Voices Festival of International Literature, where I had the pleasure last spring to hear him deliver the Arthur Miller Freedom to Write lecture, in which he told the audience, the creative act requires not only freedom, but also this assumption of freedom. If the creative artist worries if he will still be free tomorrow, then he will not be free today. In 1989, the Iranian cleric Ayatollah Khomeini declared a fatwa promising eternal life for any believer who assassinated Rushdie as punishment for the perceived blasphemies of his novel, The Satanic Verses. His new memoir, Joseph Anton, reveals how that fatwa changed Salman Rushdie's life and, one might argue, the world as we know it. The Satanic Verses, wrote Margaret Drabble, was hijacked by the exterminating angels of wrath, a wrath that still flames around us. Rushdie's Japanese translator was murdered, and another translator and his Norwegian publisher suffered bloody attacks. Across the Islamic world, protesters were killed at violent anti-Rushdie demonstrations. Joseph Anton is a clarifying book, a brutally honest book, one that tackles great moral conundrums. How do we respond to attacks on who we are and what we believe in our deepest core to be true? Rushdie's book, The Satanic Verses, for which he suffered 10 years of hiding under the fatwa, which was officially lifted in 1998, is still in print in 46 languages, a small victory in an ongoing battle. And Joseph Anton, the memoir we will discuss today, has just been published in 17 different languages and has received rave reviews from coast to coast. Last night, as you heard, Salman Rushdie received the LAPL Literary Award, and the Los Angeles Public Library and the Library Foundation of Los Angeles is proud to honor him here today. Please welcome Salman Rushdie. Congratulations again on the award.
Oh, thank you.
And on this magnificent book, which is one of the most absorbing, beautiful memoirs I've ever read. I thought it would be great if we could start, if you would be willing to read an excerpt about how the book got its title and you got your name. There we go.
Yeah. Yes, okay, let's read this. I think it's self-explanatory. He needed a name. The police told him in Wales. The book is written in the third person. His own name was useless. It was a name that could not be spoken, like Voldemort. in the not yet written Harry Potter books. He could not rent a house with it or register to vote, because to vote you needed to provide a home address, and that, of course, was impossible. To protect his democratic right to free expression, he had to surrender his democratic right to choose his government. He needed to choose a name pretty pronto, and then talk to his bank manager and get the bank to agree to accept checks signed with a false name so that he could pay for things without being identified. The new name was also for the benefit of his protectors. They needed to get used to it, to call him by it at all times, when they were with him and when they weren't, so that they didn't accidentally let his real name slip when they were walking or running or going to the gym or the supermarket and blow his cover. The Prot, that's slang for protection, the Prot had a name, Operation Malachite. He did not know why the job had been given the name of a green stone, and neither did they. They were not writers. And the reason and the reasons for names were not important to them. But now it was his turn to rename himself. Probably better not to make it an Asian name, Stan said. Stan's one of the police officers. People put two and two together sometimes. So he was to give up his race as well. He would be an invisible man in whiteface. He thought of writers he loved and tried combinations of their names. Vladimir Joyce. Marcel Beckett. Franz Stern. He made lists of such combinations, but all of them sounded ridiculous. Then he found one that did not. He wrote down side by side the first names of Conrad and Chekhov. And there it was, his name for the next 11 years. Joseph Anton. Jolly good, Stan said. You won't mind if we call you Joe. In fact, he did mind. He soon discovered that he detested the abbreviation for reasons he did not fully understand. After all, why was Joe so much worse than Joseph? He was neither one, and they should have struck him as equally phony or equally suitable. But Joe grated on him almost from the beginning. Nevertheless, that monosyllable was what the protection officers found it easiest to master and remember. So Joe, it had to be. He had spent his life naming fictional characters. Now, by naming himself, he had turned himself into a sort of fictional character as well. Conrad Chekhov wouldn't have worked, but Joseph Anton was someone who might exist, who now did exist. Conrad, the translingual creator of wanderers, of voyagers into the heart of darkness, of secret agents in a world of killers and bombs, and of at least one immortal coward hiding from his shame. And Chekhov, the master of loneliness and of melancholy, of the beauty of an old world destroyed, like the trees in a cherry orchard, by the brutality of the new. Chekhov, whose three sisters believed that real life was elsewhere and yearned eternally for a Moscow to which they could not return. These were his godfathers now. It was Conrad who gave him the motto to which he clung as if to a lifeline in the long years that followed. In the now unacceptably titled The Nigger of the Narcissus, the hero, a sailor named James Waite, stricken with tuberculosis on a long sea voyage, is asked by a fellow sailor why he came aboard, knowing that he was unwell. I must live till I die, mustn't I? Waite replies. In his present circumstances, the question felt like a command. Joseph Anton, he told himself, you must live till you die.
Thank you. So you had to find a way to write about this formless time, this amoral universe that you were thrown into, where your life was taken apart. I was just reading Midnight's Children, which the fictional character speaks in the first person, and here you have the memoir, which you're in the third person.
It's a non-fictional character.
Non-fictional character.
Person.
Could you talk a little bit just about how you came to that decision?
Well, I mean, I do think of those two books in a funny way as being related. Midnight's Children, after all, is a novel that, to some degree, is drawn from certainly memories of childhood. Celine, the hero's life is much less like mine as he grows up, but I think certainly when he's a child, he essentially lives in my house and goes to my school and has some friends who are at least composites of people I used to know. So there, if you like, there I've got a novel, or a book a novel at the very beginning of my career, which takes real life and turns it into fiction. And here I've got a work of nonfiction which I tried to write like a novel, in which I don't turn it into fiction, but it's written as if it was. So these two things, I don't know, these two books seem to me to be looking at each other across a very long distance.
Interesting.
Looking at each other suspiciously.
And the third person, you found it liberating.
I just found it easier. I tried writing it in the first person.
You did?
When I started, I thought obviously, write it in the first. It's an autobiography, write it in the first person, and I just didn't like it. Me. I thought, shut up. And I really didn't like the tone of voice. And as you say, I have written first-person narratives without any problem, but it's just felt different when the first person is somebody you made up. rather than yourself.
This gave you a certain distance, too.
Yeah,
to be
well,
able
one of
to-
the reasons for not writing the book for so long was also to have that distance, you know,
Right.
was to be able to reflect in tranquility, as the saying goes, you know. And yeah, I also felt that the me that the book's about, which after all is a much younger self, you know, like at the time of the fatwa, I was 41 years old, you know, so it's 24 years ago. I did feel that me was a little bit not quite
Right.
who I am
You are
now after all this happened to me, you know. So I felt that I just wanted to suggest that the me that's writing the book is not identical with the me being written
Yeah, I
about.
think that really works.
You know,
really,
and
really,
so
really
there was
works.
that too.
Right after what they called the Rushdie affair in Britain began, there were polls that showed that a large majority of the British public felt that you should apologize for this offensive book. And they accused you of doing it on purpose, which was kind of a code. And you write about being genuinely perplexed when you first were accused of the book being offensive. Could you talk a little bit about why you were perplexed and what are the implications of that phrase, doing it on purpose? Could you unpack that for us?
First of all, you know, obviously I did it on purpose. How do you work for 5 years on a book by accident?
I guess they didn't know that, right?
You know, the idea that I would somehow unintentionally produce a novel
Automatic writing, sort of. Yes.
seemed like it's an odd accusation. You know, the question is, what do they mean by it?
Right.
Right? And what they meant, of course, was some kind of insult. And I've always said, you know, if I want to insult people, I could do it much faster than that. It doesn't take five. Yeah, it takes 2 sentences. Doesn't take 5 years and 250,000 words.
It takes a gesture, yeah.
Let's not talk about your personal habits here.
Deal.
So there was an assumption. The way in which this book was very rapidly turned into something much cruder than a novel, it was the way in which it was sort of sloganized and reduced to just, you know, that strange thing, an insult. That's what people thought I'd done on purpose. And actually, I mean, I know that there have been many occasions since where people, both Muslim readers and non-Muslim readers, have read the book and written to me and said, could you just explain to me where the problem is? Because I don't seem to be able to see where the problem is.
Even Iranian booksellers who had the book before saw no problem.
No, I mean, I had the strange experience that my previous novel, Shame, had been translated into Farsi in Iran without my agreement, you know, pirated translation, published, and had then been given a prize as the best novel translated into Farsi that year. And just for the record, I never got the prize. If there was an object, you know, I didn't receive it, and if there was some form of check attached to it, you know, that didn't show up either. But apparently it won this prize, and so when the Satanic Verses came out, I guess I mean there's 1 or 2 English language bookstores in Tehran and elsewhere. There's not many, but they thought, well, you know, he's okay. He must be okay because they gave him a prize, so they obviously think he's cool. And so they imported, you know, I mean, I don't know how a couple of 100 copies of the Satanic Verses into Iran, which were then on sale openly for 6 months.
Wow.
Without creating any kind of fuss at all, you know. And then the Ayatollah Khomeini said what he said, and
but he never saw the book, apparently.
No, of course he didn't sell the book.
He never saw the book.
He was really deeply unwell, and he in fact died a couple of months later. So he was essentially on his deathbed, and he was he certainly wasn't reading 600-page novels in English.
So you suspected from the very beginning that the fatwa came from the top down, not the bottom up. And how soon did you know that to be true? I mean, then it was also, how did it serve him? How did it serve Khomeini, and how did it serve the British clerics in London too?
Well, I mean, you know, this is all one of the reasons why I've been saying that these things are political, not theological. You know, is you have to look at the politics of it. And at that particular moment, the Iranian Revolution was in a little trouble because of its catastrophic war with Iraq, in which
Huge casualties.
huge casualties, and it had really a generation of young men lost, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and so the revolution was probably at its least popular moment since it had happened a decade earlier. And Khomeini, I guess, was looking for a way of rallying the troops, and that turned out to be me, to my misfortune. And I mean, I've often thought that if the book had been published a year later, or if he had passed away 6 months earlier, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I mean, I think it was just bad timing, to put it mildly. In Britain, it was a very interesting phenomenon that if you look at the politics of ethnic minority groups in England in the previous 20 years, they had more or less nothing to do with religion. I mean, they were kind of left-wing socialist politics, basically. I mean, and people didn't call themselves, Muslim or Hindu or whatever. The term that was used was British Asian, and that went across religious boundaries. And the religious boundaries were not seen as a way of separating these groups. Occasionally there were divisions which were usually caused by political events in the Indian subcontinent. So that, for instance, in the early 70s, when what became Bangladesh fought its war of secession from Pakistan, suddenly this war was fought in London at the level of Indian restaurants. So the places were identified as Pakistani or Bangladeshi, and it really was a problem if you got that wrong. But in general, there wasn't a religious sectarian division. And this was one of the occasions that essentially the mosques in England used to try and exert control over the community, which they had lost, they didn't have, and actually it was quite successful.
And they were relentless. It was quite a story. Your friend Hanif Qureshi wrote, he said, "I didn't see the satanic verses controversy coming. He said, I was flabbergasted. How could a community that I identified with turn against a writer who was one of its most articulate voices?"
Yeah.
I mean, it was...
Well, it was upsetting, yeah. There was one story which I have to say I take a certain mischievous pleasure in, which is that a group of Irish construction workers who had been employed to work on a gigantic new mosque being built in the British Midlands sent a letter to me saying that during the course of the construction, when they were laying the foundations and pouring the concrete and so on, that they'd dropped a copy of the Satanic Verses.
Over 600 pages, and that is not in the book.
Into the foundation.
I don't think you got that in there.
Didn't I put it in?
No, you didn't.
Oh, I thought I did put it in. Well, anyway, there you are. This kind of,
That's a great... That's
an extra. But anyway, there it is. There's this huge mosque built on my novel.
I love it. I love it. What are among the many delightful parts of this book, and it's really an incredible read, is what you write about your childhood, about your parents, the childhood of the man who was forced to become the character, Joseph Anton. And you write about how storytelling was really your birthright. Tell us a little bit about the stories that you grew up listening to as a child. Of course, last night we learned that also included great works of Dell Comics, but the stories that your father read to you as a child.
Yes, well, I mean, of course, Superman and Batman were certainly...
From the library?
From a little lending library around the corner in Bombay where I lived. You could go and buy all this American crap.
Which served you well.
No, absolutely.
Right.
In fact, there are people I've seen who seriously advance the theory that Midnight's Children is somehow based on the X-Men.
Someone's PhD thesis.
Because they all have special powers and so on. So yes, it's a kind of another story of mutants. So if somebody wants to make a movie, I'd be available for discussions later on.
But of the works
Midnight's X-Men.
Of literature.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think one of the things that's the kind of birthright of people who grow up in the Indian subcontinent is this extraordinary group of what are called wonder tales. And that's of which, of course, I mean, the Arabian Nights is the best known, but it's and actually a thing that people perhaps don't know is that many of the stories which were collected finally in Arabic in the Arabian Nights are stories which originated in India. Because at the time there was a collection there's a now lost collection of stories, which was written in Farsi, which was the court language at the time. It was called Hazar Afsana, which means 1,000 stories. And this particular anthology of stories gradually made its way west, into Persia, and through Persia into the Arabic-speaking world, where it was translated into Arabic, and many of those stories became the stories that were collected in the Arabian Nights. And then at a certain point, the Scheherazade story is put around that, and the book takes the form that we now have. But many of the actual stories within the story are Indian in origin. So we had those, and then there were animal fables, the Panchatantra fables. There were stories of, sort of, kind of, as one might say, magic realist stories of great heroes like the Hamzanama and the Adventures of Hatim Tai. All these collections where mighty heroes would cut ogres in half and marry fairy princesses and all of that. Have winged horses and flying carpets, and so you grew up with that as the basic world of story, and then some Western stories arrived too. I mean, Alice in Wonderland was there, but oddly, Winnie the Pooh was not. So I only found out about Winnie the Pooh when I was much older. But the Alice stories were colossally important to me.
And as well, so you grew up in a secular Muslim family in Bombay. We won't call it Mumbai, as you instructed us last night. Your father was a scholar of Islam.
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about how the structures of both Hinduism and Islam shaped your thinking as you grew up, those kind of structures.
Well, one of the great things about polytheism is that the stories are better.
More to choose from. Yeah.
And so Hinduism, of course, is an inexhaustible storehouse of great stories. And if you're going to steal the good stuff. And so I did certainly, for instance, one of the characteristics of the elephant-headed god Ganesh is that he is a patron of literature. I mean, according to legend, Ganesh was so much an admirer of poetry that when the semi-mythological bard, the Homer figure, Vyasa, sat down to write the Mahabharata, Ganesh came and sat at his feet and acted as the scribe. So ever since then, there's a relationship between Ganesh and literature. So then Salim in Midnight's Children has a very big nose. And I thought, that gave him a connection to an elephant-headed god. So those kinds of narrative have always sort of wound in and out of my stuff. And the Islamic stories, I mean, I just thought the thing that interested me is, given that I was a historian by training, that the story of the origin story of Islam is the only one of the great world religions that takes place inside recorded history. So instead of having legends about the origin of Christianity, which is essentially what we have, you have actual hard facts. You have historical facts. You know about the social and economic conditions of Arabia at the time. You know about its transition from a nomadic society to a settled urban society, from nomadic matriarchal communities to urbanized patriarchal communities, with the changes that makes in family life. And we know about the Prophet himself and how he was an orphan, and he came from a family that had fallen on hard times economically, and he made a good marriage, and then he was a merchant on his wife's behalf, and very successful, and didn't actually begin to be a prophet until he was 40 years old, but had a kind of mystical tendency and would often go off onto this hill outside Makkah in order to be alone. And at a certain point, when he's on this hill, this archangel appears to him, and this other narrative begins. I mean, so I just thought, you study that historically, you look at how how the text of the Quran connects to circumstances in the history of the country at the time, the region at the time, and you learn a lot. I mean, to give you just one example, on these merchant trips, on these caravan trails, of course, the oasis becomes a central location where people would stop and spend the night or whatever. And very often the oases in Arabia were run by Christians. They were run by this sect of Christians called Nestorian Christians. And Nestorian Christianity is a kind of desert variation of Christianity. So some of the Bible stories are altered to suit desert conditions. So for instance, the story of Jesus, according to Nestorian Christianity, relocates his birth to an oasis under a palm tree. And in the Quran, the account of the birth of Jesus in the chapter called Maryam, Mary, is exactly that he's born in an oasis under a palm tree. Now, if you happen to know that the person through whom this book came to be was somebody who was traveling on these trips and learning these stories from these stops in the oases where these versions were the ones available, I mean, it's not so hard to join the dots.
Right.
But then, of course, that's blasphemy, because this is the word of God, and God wasn't listening to Nestorian Christians in an oasis, etc. So this is the problem. When you're deprived of the ability to historicize the stories, it seems to me you lose a lot of what's most interesting about them, and that's what I thought. It's out of that spirit that I thought I was writing. Seemed like a perfectly serious thing to do.
And you had encountered the story of the Satanic Verses when you were studying Islam in a private tutorial, right? At Cambridge.
At Cambridge, I did a history degree at Cambridge, and in my final year, one of the special subjects that I studied was about Muhammad and the rise of Islam, and that's where this strange story, the so-called anecdote, the incident of the Satanic Verses, that's where I came across it. And I mean,
And you stored it away.
I stored it away. I thought, good story, And
it really was.
I say in the book, 20 years later, I found out how good a story it was, But it's not a story I made up,
right? Right.
And it exists within many of the most authoritative traditions of the Prophet.
I loved reading about that in the book. That was so interesting. During the years of the fatwa, you among the things you wrote a monograph about the Wizard of Oz, which I loved, which is also a great story, as you point out, about the power of friendship. And there was so much friendship and kindness and bravery that was shown to you from various publishers, from friends, and all sorts of great writers appear in this book. Hanif Qureshi, Graham Greene, Margaret Atwood, Harold Pinter, Michael Ondaatje, Ian McEwan, among your good friends, Christopher Hitchens, Susan Sontag, Carlos Fuentes. And there were even 100 Muslim writers who wrote on your behalf. And yet there were some Western writers, particularly some on the left, and this really surprised me reading the book, who did not support you, quite publicly did not. And I wondered how they could not understand what was at stake in this scenario.
You'll have to ask them. There weren't a lot, but some of them were prominent, and I mean, the one that really took me by surprise was John Berger.
Yeah, that was the one that really surprised me.
Because I knew John Berger, and I always thought we were on perfectly good terms, and in fact, when this was quite soon after the fatwa, and I was staying in some appalling, sort of damp farm cottage in mid-Wales. And the police went out and got me the newspapers. And I got the newspapers, and I saw on the front page that it flagged that there was an article by John Berger inside. And I thought, oh, good, assuming that it would be supportive. And when I turned to it and discovered that he was attacking me in very ungenerous language, I was really shocked.
So would you, one analysis is like that someone who is such a staunch defender of like the masses couldn't believe that like the Arab street would be wrong?
Well, I think the masses can't be wrong.
The masses can't be wrong, is that it?
That's a Marxist rule.
Yeah.
The people can't be incorrect.
Doesn't serve him well.
And I know, the thing is, John Berger and I we have quite a few friends in common, and all of them were horrified that he had written this, and all of them called him up and said, "What the hell do you think you're talking about?" And he immediately clammed up. He wouldn't talk about it, and from that day to this, he's refused to discuss it. So you hope he's embarrassed, you know.
Someday, find
but,
out.
But probably not, you know. I mean, I don't know.
During the first years of the fatwa, you were counseled to keep a low profile, to
Yeah,
remain
the first
silent.
12 months really was
First
the
the 12
worst,
months.
yeah.
And, you know, you had, I mean, I think it's really hard for us to understand, and you really found a language to convey this. Like, you did not know. We know now how long it lasted, but in the moment, you did not know, would it last a few months? Would it last years? It was like, as Borges had that fabulous passage about the pampas, like you can't capture it in one photograph. But you were you wanted it to stop, and you even talk about, you know, you also wanted to be liked. You wanted to make some conciliatory gesture, so maybe it would stop. So if there was, you did make a gesture, and it's a really interesting part of the book, because what it taught you was really profound, and it really influenced your stance in the later years of that time. Could you talk a little bit about that gesture?
Well, it's you know, well, there's two things to it. One is that this was about, I guess, 2 years into the narrative, so like the late part of 1990, and I wasn't in very good shape. I mean, I was reading my journals of the period, and it becomes quite clear that the person writing the journals isn't in great mental shape. You know, I was very, to put it mildly, very depressed. And meanwhile, there was a lot of external pressure of the sort you described, to in some way appease or, assuage the feelings of, or do something.
Do something.
Do something.
Yeah.
You know, and there was very much this suggestion that, you broke it, you fix it, and that somehow the responsibility for bringing this to a close was mine.
Not only finding where you were going to live, but bringing it to a close.
Yeah, somehow solving the problem.
Solving the problem.
And the only way it could be solved is by a kind of surrender, if you like. And the fact that I refused to withdraw the book, which there were people saying I should do, was called arrogance, right? And so that created a character for me as this arrogant, self-regarding person who, of course, was making lots of money because the book was selling a lot, and that was wrong too. So there was all of that, and you can imagine with somebody who's already in a very unhappy state of mind, that external pressure was telling.
And also being accused of costing the British government money on top of that, because you needed to be protected, which you did.
Yes, I mean, perish the thought that the British government should have to spend money to protect a British citizen against international terrorism. Anyway, all of that, and at some point this all led to my being essentially sort of suckered into a meeting with a group of Islamic leaders who were promising that if I came along and said the right things, that they would act to solve the problem by telling everybody that it was over now. And I was wanting to believe that.
Right.
And so I allowed myself to get into this situation where they gave me this piece of paper to sign, and I realized that the piece of paper included a declaration of faith. And I'm, the least religious person I know, now that Christopher's dead. Before that, I was the second least religious person I knew. And yet, I found myself signing the document, in this spirit of peacemaking, if you like. And immediately I did it. I just felt, I knew I'd made the biggest mistake of my life, and I left this room where this meeting had taken place. So my body knew it before my mind. I immediately started throwing up. I was really, really sick. And then all my close friends told me I was insane, and I thought they were probably right. And my sister, who's I'm very, very close to, called me and said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Because I mean, she knows who I am, And she said, "Have you gone mad?" And I said, "Yeah, maybe."
Maybe so.
Anyway, it was clearly a kind of rock bottom moment, because I thought I'd sort of betrayed myself at that moment, because I'd said something I didn't believe. And of course, it didn't work at all,
Right.
because all those people, I had been deliberately led into a trap. They weren't going to do any of that. They weren't going to go out there and put their own necks on the line by saying it's fine, we've made peace. They didn't do anything. So it wasn't even effective. But more than that, I felt that I lost a lot of self-respect at that time. But in retrospect, looking back at it, and one of the things I try and say in the book is that I think it was a pivotal moment for me, not just in this story, but in my life, because it just showed me, don't do that again.
And it showed you what you talk about, the failure of quietism. I love this quote. You say, an invisible, silenced man was an empty space into which others could pour their prejudices, their agendas, their wrath. The fight against fanaticism needed visible faces, audible voices, and he would be quiet no longer. He would try to become a loud, invisible man. And so it really changed your tack.
I thought, if you do something weak, you're treated like a weakling.
Right.
And it seemed to me after that, I thought, the hell with this, I'm not going to make compromises about things that there must be no compromise about. Enough with like appeasement and apology and mollification, and the hell with all that. There's something to fight about here, and I'm going to try and be in that fight.
And
it just clarified something.
And did that start to lift you out of the depression?
I immediately felt better. I immediately felt better because I felt clearer in my head. And I no longer, the chapter which talks about this in the book is called The Trap of Wanting to be Loved. And I had this sort of crazy idea in those early days that I could just explain myself out of this. That I could just say, look, if you just let me explain, I'll tell you what the book's really about, and you will understand that I'm not a bad guy, I'm actually a nice guy, you've made a terrible mistake, and now that you've understood that, let's all go home and we can all get on. And I just thought I could actually write my way out of it, by just explaining well. And
that was
idiocy, right? And just to be released from that trap, to think, okay, there are going to be people who don't like me. And guess what? I don't like them much either. And it's okay. I don't care. I'm going to say what I have to say, and I'm going to argue what I have to argue, and if you don't like it, tough. Deal with it. And that clarity arrived out of that hitting the bottom of the barrel moment. And I think has made me the person that I was then able to be, because you have to ask yourself this question when you're in a jam like this. Is it worth it? It's only a damn book. Withdraw the book, get on with your life.
And it was affecting, your son, your,
all
your wife,
your
everyone around you. So.
And I found that I could not think like that. I found that I could not do that. I couldn't make that act of surrender. And then I thought, well, why not? What's so important? And the answer to what's so important is something that I try and say in the book, and it's something actually that Christopher Hitchens said in quite separately, independently, with no conferring, that what we both came to feel about this was that it was a struggle in which everything we cared about was on one side and everything we hated most was on the other side. That, on one side, bigotry, intolerance, violence, narrow-mindedness, ignorance, including ignorance of their own tradition. And on the other side, literature, imagination, and this larger idea, liberty. And I thought, okay, I thought you didn't choose the fight. The fight chose me in a way, but it's the right fight. And if that's the fight I'm in, do your best, fight it.
Well, when you talk about, yes, we agree. Do you think that this country is the most likely place for progressive Muslim values to really take root?
Yes, I do believe that, because I think the Muslim community here is quite sophisticated. For a start, in England, for instance, there's one of the historical problems is that much of the migration from the Indian subcontinent came from very remote rural areas, and of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And as a result, the communities, they were essentially village communities with a kind of non-cosmopolitan, non-urban mindset, which came and settled in England. And I think that created substantial problems of adjustment and frictions and so on. I mean, the community here is much more, let's say, middle class. It's better educated. It's more, and I think it's much more, to use a complicated word, integrated. You know, and so I do think it's easier here. Yes.
And maybe this community and other progressive Muslim communities will be able to be in communication with the progressive elements of the Arab Spring, because that's going to be a long, long process.
Yeah,
right?
that's, I mean, you know, maybe, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that I learned from the study of history was don't speculate about the future. Because it's hard enough to understand the past.
Hear, hear.
And the future, one of the things about the future is that it will always surprise you. You know, that you will, I mean, I've always thought this whole science of futurology, you know, that exists now is the science of being wrong about the future. because that just simply never happens. You know, if on December the 31st, 1988, I had suggested to you that 1 year later the Soviet Union would not exist. It just would not exist. That Nelson Mandela would be free, etc. I mean, you would have thought, never happen. Can't happen.
Stunning.
You know? And yet, boom, there it was. In 1989, it's an extraordinary year. You know, Mandela, the Soviet Union, Tiananmen, you know.
And you watched it, you observed it under a fatwa, right?
Yeah, there was this moment when I was watching Mandela walking to freedom on TV. It was a complicated moment. I just thought, good for you.
Your moment would come. We're going to open up to you in just a moment. Salman, I thought it'd be wonderful if you could just conclude this portion of our program with reading this beautiful passage from the book. I loved that so much.
Oh, yeah, all right. At the heart of the dispute over the satanic verses, he said, behind all the accusations and abuse was a question of profound importance. Who shall have control over the story? Who should have the power not only to tell the stories with which and within which we all lived, but also to say in what manner those stories may be told? For everyone lived by and inside stories, the so-called grand narratives. The nation was a story, the family was another, religion was a third. As a creative artist, he knew that the only answer to the question was everyone and anyone has or should have that power. We should all be free to take the grand narratives to task, to argue with them, satirize them, and insist that they change to reflect the changing times. We should speak of them reverently, irreverently, passionately, caustically, or however we chose. That was our right as members of an open society. In fact, one could say that our ability to retell and remake the story of our culture was the best proof that our societies were indeed free. In a free society, the argument over the grand narratives never ceased. It was the argument itself that mattered. The argument was freedom. But in a closed society, those who possessed political or ideological power invariably tried to shut down these debates. We will tell you the story, they said, and we will tell you what it means. We will tell you how the story is to be told, and we forbid you to tell it any other way. If you do not like the way we tell the story, then you are an enemy of the state or a traitor to the faith. You have no rights. Woe betide you. We will come after you and teach you the meaning of your refusal. The storytelling animal, that's us, must be free to tell his tales.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Congratulations on the award, and we look forward to seeing Midnight's Children. Thank you.